Nuisance barking is a major reason why dogs are relinquished to shelters. Even if you tolerate a dog's barking, it can wear down on all but the most patient dog owners. Teaching a dog to bark on cue and be quiet on cue helps us in two ways. 1. Putting a nuisance behavior on cue and then stimulus control will reduce the frequency of the behavior occurring on its own. Simply put, if we teach a dog to bark when we ask for it and reinforce that behavior, the dog will be less likely to do it unless it's requested. 2. Teaching a quiet cue allows us to stop barking, and dogs learn behaviors quickly if we can teach them in opposite pairs. Set up the environment such that the dog is likely to bark. In the case of Elaine, I knocked the wall to prompt a bark, and clicked then treated for the bark. After a series of repetitions, I stopped knocking and I waited. I wanted to see if Elaine would offer the behavior and bark on her own. As soon as she did, I clicked, then treated. Elaine's offered bark ranged from a low growl to a quiet bark to a loud, piercing bark. I want a loud bark, so I simply stopped reinforcing low growls or quiet barks, only clicking for loud, piercing barks. Once I got the bark I liked, I added a cue. I cued a talk talk hand gesture just as Elaine was about to begin barking. This is a very important part of training a useful bark cue. It is important that Elaine only be reinforced for barking when it is cued. I intentionally allowed Elaine to offer a bark and intentionally did not click then treat for it. After a moment of silence, I gave the cue and then clicked the resulting bark. The dog must learn that reinforcement only comes from this behavior when it is cued. Teaching a quiet cue is easy with classical conditioning. Simply give the cue for quiet. I'm using a shh hand gesture. Pause for half a second, and then give the dog a treat. With the consistent pairing of the quiet cue to the delivery of a treat, the dog will soon start to anticipate the delivery of a treat once the cue is given. It is very important that during this process, that when you give the quiet cue, you give a treat. Using classical conditioning to train behaviors means that once you give the cue, you promise to give the treat, no matter what the dog is doing, including when they continue to bark. In the following video on the last trial, you will see Elaine look to the floor when I cue quiet. She's looking for the treat. Quiet is an operant behavior. After enough repetitions of pairing the quiet cue with a treat, you should observe that upon giving the quiet cue, the dog stops barking and eagerly anticipates for the delivery of a treat. At that point, you can move to using operant conditioning to reinforce the behavior. Give the quiet cue. Observe silence of a short duration, then click then treat for silence. Bark and quiet as paired cues. Training bark and quiet together makes a lot of sense. Cue bark, and once the dog barks, cue quiet. When the dog is quiet, click then treat. For dogs that find barking a reinforcing activity all by itself, you can actually cue your dog to be quiet, and then after they've been quiet, reinforce them by cueing them to bark. Permission to bark is the reinforcer for the quiet. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. If you'd like to learn more and get coaching from us, enroll in our online dog training school at treatpouch.com.